we have been discussing about the paper which is entitled as Introduction to Philosophy. This paper is being introduced in semester 1 for the students of philosophy honors in the University of Delhi, and it is a discipline specific core paper. We have been discussing in this paper about the themes of metaphysics and epistemology. We have had discussed about the origin of metaphysics in our previous class. We will be continuing with the origin of epistemology in this class. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, when we talk about the origin of epistemology, we must first understand that epistemology is derived from the Greek word episteme, which is to do with knowledge. Epistemology was basically developed as an antithesis for its other part, which is the doxography, where dogmatic opinions were believed to be the true sources. And this is when the epistemologist felt the need to establish epistemology with its finest vigor. So the question then, why epistemology emerged later or after metaphysics? It is because epistemology arises when philosophers asked, how can we be sure that our metaphysical claims are true? Thus, epistemology is reflective, it is critical, it is second order. It becomes urgent when we see there has been a rise of skepticism, when there has been the scientific method that has developed, and of course the religious authority that has been questioned. Some of the early epistemological reflections can be seen with Plato, where with knowledge as episteme versus opinion, the doxa debate has been on. With Plato, we also see under the early epistemological reflections the theme of the theory of recollection. Also, the theme of knowledges of forms can also be clubbed as an epistemological reflections from the earliest times. If we pick up Aristotle, we see knowledge that begins with sense perception, intellect, abstract universals, and that is somehow still embedded within metaphysics to be some of the early epistemological reflections. Going ahead with the modern epistemologists, the 17th century onwards, this is precisely the stage which there has been a true birth of epistemology as a separate discipline. With René Descartes' methodological doubt, the cogito ergo sum, we see that knowledge, if it is termed as knowledge, it must be indubitable. And the two pointers that Descartes had mentioned was clarity and distinctness. He had said that any proposition that passes through the litmus test of clarity and distinctness is only the indubitable truth, not otherwise. Thus, epistemology becomes the foundation of philosophy. Now, if we are to check some of the empiricists as displayed in the PPT here, we see that the philosophers Locke, Berkeley, and Hume are picked up. With Berkeley, he says that mind is a tabula rasa. Tabula rasa means it is an empty slate. Empty slate means that when one is born with a blank slate. So it is only with experience or sense perception that one gains knowledge. Empiricists had started establishing its hold as a counter argument or a counter reasoning to the rationalists. Now, then comes Berkeley with his philosophy Esse est percipi. Now, esse est percipi basically means to be is to be perceived, which means that to exist means there is a seer who is seeing me. Now, this of course doesn't mean that if I have not seen something it will cease to exist, but it basically means that there is a universal seer, Berkeley, please understand, he is basically a Bishop Berkeley, so his ultimate goal was the establishment of ontological existence of God. So he sees that there has to be a universal perceiver who is perceiving everything, all of us at all time, and that is how we have the format of to be, or that which exists. Going ahead, we have Hume, who talks about skepticism about causality. So his philosophy again is important, because as much as Locke talks about mind as tabula rasa, we have Berkeley who talks about esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived, and then Hume. His skepticism about causality has been an important mark in our philosophy. Further ahead, there is Immanuel Kant. Kant talks about the synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. Thus, Kant's philosophy is also called as the Copernican revolution. Now, what is this Copernican revolution? Copernican revolution is that where, if you all remember, there was this scientist, philosopher called Ptolemy, who had said that the Earth is at the center, and the sun, along with the other planets, revolve around the earth. And Ptolemy's philosophy was considered authentic and valid for a very long time, until Copernicus arrived in the scene. And then Copernicus says, Mr. Ptolemy, this is where it is problematic. I agree what you have said. However, it isn't the case that the earth is at the center, but rather it is the sun that is at the center, and all the other planets, including the earth, revolves around the sun. And this synthesis is marked with Immanuel Kant's synthesis, where he tried to bridge in rationalism and empiricism, and thus his approach is called as Copernican approach or Copernican revolution. So with Kant, we see that he had given the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, the shift from what is reality to how is knowledge of reality possible. Thus, Kant marks the epistemological turn. Going ahead in our PPT, we see that epistemology in Indian philosophy is equally interesting. Indian systems developed the Pramana Shastra, or the theory of knowledge. The Nyaya school, which is also called, the Pramanas, or the valid sources of knowledge for them, has been Pratyaksha, perception, Anumana, inference, and Shabda, which is the verbal testimony. With Buddhism, we have momentariness, perception-centered momentariness, for they believed in the theory of Anatmavada, which is the no-soul theory, and thus they talked about the Shanakavada, or the theory of momentariness. In the school of Advaita Vedanta, there is the sublation of ignorance, and that is why they talk about Aham Brahmasmi, or I am Brahman, and that realization, once it is, we know that epistemologically we are taken care of. Thus, knowledge from the Indian philosophical school is evaluated pragmatically and liberatively, because be it the Nyaya or the Buddhists or the Advaitins, I'm not even mentioning the rest, their ultimate aim is moksha or nibbana or nirvana. We also have a fundamental difference between metaphysics and epistemology, and that is the core distinction that we have been talking here. This PPT, as we can check here, the very central aspect or the question. So metaphysicists or the metaphysicians would ask, what is real? Epistemologists would say, how do we know? The focus for metaphysics is being and existence. For epistemology, it is knowledge and justification. The orientation for metaphysics is ontological. For epistemological, it has to be cognitive. The primary concern for metaphysics is reality itself. For epistemology, it is our access to reality. Now, the aspect of risk, if we are to talk, we see that metaphysics finds or sees it as dogmatism, and for epistemology, it is skepticism. If we are to check the relationship with metaphysics and epistemology that we are questioning or that we are seeking right now, we see it is a structural relationship. Metaphysics asserts, epistemology questions. Metaphysics builds a world picture, epistemology examines the tools of knowing. Epistemology acts as a critical checkpoint for metaphysics. Now, some of the philosophical significance of the distinction, we would say that without metaphysics, philosophy loses depth and meaning. Without epistemology, philosophy becomes speculative and ungrounded. Their tension generates skepticism, scientific methodology, phenomenology, analytic philosophy. As Kant had famously said, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Thus, metaphysics asks what the world is. Epistemology asks how the mind can know any world at all. So, if we are now to talk about some of the sources or the primary readings or the first systematic thinkers, we will say that with metaphysics, Parmenides from the 5th century BCE can be picked up as a true metaphysician for his work on nature, which is a fragmentary poem, talks about the same. Parmenides is the first philosopher to explicitly distinguish being from appearance. Parmenides' core metaphysical claim has been what it is, what is not, is not. He introduces ontology, which is the study of being, as a philosophical problem. Thus, Parmenides is often called the father of ontology. So we see that metaphysics and ontology goes hand in hand. So as much as metaphysics is a discipline, whatever we are discussing, the existence of the being, the ontos or the ontic comes from ontology. And here, as much as Aristotle is considered as the father of classical metaphysics, Parmenides is considered as the father of ontology. We also have Plato. Specifically in his dialogues, The Republic, Phaedo, Timaeus. We see that there have been certainly certain key metaphysical ideas as the theory of forms. We also see the discussion of the two-level reality about being versus becoming, or soul as immortal and immaterial. Plato gives metaphysics a transcendent and normative structure. So if Parmenides can be taken as the father of ontology, Plato further polishes it. So with Plato, in his theory of forms, he had said that form is, or the world of idea, is the basic reality. The world that we live in is a duplicate or an imitation of the real world. What is the real world? The real world is the world of ideas. The world that we are living in is an imitation, a pale imitation of the real world. And so he says that the inhabitants of this world is already 1 degree away from reality. And this is one of the reasons why Plato was critical of artists and painters and other such creative minds. For what they do is they further take us to a world which is at 3 degrees away from reality. So for Plato, theory of forms is the only real world or the ideas, and the world that we live in is a pale imitation of the perfect world outside. And the minute he talks about outside, he is referring to the dialogue or to the debate between being versus becoming. Thus, for Plato, soul is seen as immortal and immaterial, which is vividly seen in his dialogues with Phaedo and others. And Plato thus gives metaphysics a boost, which was not seen before. Now, the game changes with the arrival of Aristotle. Aristotle, as we had just about mentioned, has been technically called as the founder of metaphysics as a discipline, for he was the first one to have written something under the theme called metaphysics, physics, and on the soul, or de anima. So Aristotle is the first to name and systematize metaphysics. He defines metaphysics as the science of being qua being. Aristotle introduces the concept of substance, the four causes, potentiality and actuality. And thus, Aristotle's metaphysics is the earliest comprehensive metaphysical treatise. Now, the four causes, Aristotle mentions them as the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. He says that all these causation together makes potentiality and actuality possible. What is the material cause? For example, he says that a potter who makes a pot, the mud that he uses or the water that he uses, the materials used for making the pot will be the material cause. The efficient cause would be the potter himself, or if he has used machines, would be the machinery involved that helped him to efficiently come up with his material cause. The formal cause is the form or the shape or the pattern towards which the material cause was preconceived. And last but not the least, the final cause is that cause which is towards the realization for which the material cause was conceived to be made at the very first time. The reason behind being the potter might have wanted to sell it as an economical goal, or secondly, the potter might have just wanted it to gift it to someone and it could be as an aesthetic form, or he might just have wanted it to be his own personal piece. So final cause is the reason behind which this entire causation had even developed, and with this is the reason why Aristotle is rightly called as the founder of classical metaphysics. Now, similarly, with epistemology, we see that epistemology emerges later and more reflectively, often within metaphysics. Again, with epistemology, Plato comes in the picture. Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, is taken as the first epistemologically focused dialogue. Here, in Theaetetus, Plato directly asks, what is knowledge? He examines knowledge as perception, knowledge as true belief, knowledge as justified true belief implicitly. And Theaetetus, in a way, is often called as the first epistemological textbook. Again, with Aristotle, we see his contribution in the field of epistemology vis-a-vis his work Posterior Analytics or Nicomachean Ethics, specifically book 6, where Aristotle develops the theory of scientific knowledge, episteme, demonstration, first principles, and thus for Aristotle, knowledge arises from sense perception, from intellect. Aristotle gives epistemology a logical and methodological foundation. There is a very significant quotation of Aristotle that says that I respect my master, but I respect truth more than my master. Now, who was Aristotle's master? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are considered to be the teacher of the other. So in a way, as much as Socrates was the teacher of Plato, Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And usually Socrates' and Plato's philosophy goes hand in hand, where for them the theory of forms or the universal or the world beyond the senses is the real world. For Aristotle, as much as the universal world is real, the particulars are equally real or equally important. To cite an example, he says that the universal idea of, say, cowness is simply because I have particularly experienced each and every cow. So cow, unless I have seen a cow, I can never conceive the idea of cowness. So for Aristotle, the universal concept of cowness emerges or comes into the picture because I have had already experienced the particular cows. Thus, for Aristotle, particulars are important and so is universal. Now, and that for him was the truth. After Aristotle comes the terrain of René Descartes. René Descartes, the modern epistemology begins. His meditations on first philosophy, discourse on method, he shifts philosophy from the Parmenidean being to knowing. His methodology has been methodological doubt, with cogito ergo sum taking the center stage. Descartes makes epistemology the foundation of philosophy. If we are to check the Indian parallels, which is crucially important at this stage, we can to a certain extent connect metaphysics with Upanishads. Brihadnyaka Upanishads or the Chandogya Upanishads as of that matter, or if we are to talk about the Brahma Sutra, we see the content of metaphysics being central. For here, the questions such as what is the ultimate reality, Brahman, Atman identity, reality as non-dual, qualified dual are considered. Similarly, from the Indian parallel about the epistemological part, the Pramana Shastra, if we are to connect, we can talk about Gautama's Nyaya Sutra or Dignaka's Pramana Samuchaya. Also, there is Dharmakriti's Nyaya Bindu, and these texts explicitly are the theories of perception, inference, testimony. So knowledge is tied to valid cognition. Indian epistemology develops earlier and more technically than the Western tradition. So in the PPT that is being displayed here, if we are to check the comparative analysis between metaphysics and epistemology, we see that the core philosophical orientation, the aspect of fundamental question, metaphysics would be what exists. Epistemology is how do we know. The primary focus for metaphysics is reality or being. For epistemology, it is knowledge or justification. The nature of inquiry for metaphysics is ontological. For epistemology, it is cognitive and critical. For epistemology, the risk factor for metaphysics is dogmatism, and for epistemology is to do with skepticism. Thus, in the historical priority, if any, we say that, or we can at the most say that metaphysics is historically primary, where humans first ask what the world is, and epistemology is historically secondary, though they are intertwined. With epistemology, of course, arises when doubts and disagreements appear. So epistemology is, in a sense, philosophy reflecting on itself. Quickly, if we look at this PPT here, we see the methodological difference between metaphysics and epistemology. For metaphysics, it is speculative. For epistemology, it is critical. On the one hand, if metaphysics is constructive, epistemology is evaluative. Metaphysics can be or is world-oriented, epistemology mind-oriented. Metaphysics concerned with answers, epistemology question answers. Of course, these are not limited or an exhaustive list. They can jump from the one column to the other, but this was just to give the beginners, as the very paper is Introduction to Philosophy, a very basic foundation of their methodological distinction. So, at best, we can say that there is a mutual dependence. Metaphysics needs epistemology for justification. Epistemology presupposes metaphysics about mind, about truth, about reality. And all in all, we have Kant's synthesis, where epistemology sets limits, and this is what Kant has said: epistemology sets limits to metaphysics but does not abolish it. If we are to look at this PPT again between Indian and Western tradition, we see in the Western tradition, metaphysics is a separate discipline, and for Western, epistemology emerges late. In Indian tradition, metaphysics is integrated with soteriology, and epistemology is a highly systematized earlier. The goal here is the truth about being in the West, and in epistemology, it is the liberation vis-a-vis valid cognition. Thus, metaphysics constructs a vision of reality, while epistemology interrogates the legitimacy of that construction. Metaphysics asks what the world ultimately is. Epistemology asks whether the human mind is capable of knowing such a world at all. Historically, metaphysics precedes epistemology, but philosophically, epistemology disciplines metaphysics. Together, they form the twin pillars of philosophy, one ontological, the other critical, without which philosophical inquiry either becomes blind speculation or paralyzing skepticism. Thus, we can see that both philosophy of epistemology and metaphysics are not only important, but they are the foundation. And epistemology and metaphysics should be posited neither as fully autonomous nor as indistinguishably fused domains. They are best understood as distinct but porous categories whose dialogue is philosophically necessary. Absolute separation results in skepticism and abstraction. Total fusion results in dogmatism. Philosophy advances through their critical interdependence. Thank you so much. I hope this lecture on epistemology and metaphysics and their interconnection has been clear. We will be taking up more such themes from the paper Introduction to Philosophy in our next class. Thank you so much.